All right. I want to say a huge thank you to my fellow California regional coordinators for putting this program together. Susie Wampler from JASNA Southwest. Yay! Elisa Shirogo from San Diego. Sorry, I'm like, you're not Southwest. San Diego. We have so many regions, y'all. Lynn Osolinsky from Greater Sacramento, and Heather Parish from Central California. Yay!
Heather.
So speaking of Heather, I'm happy to be introducing her as your moderator for the next panel. When not coordinating for Central California region, she is also the executive director of the Rogue Performance Festival in Fresno, and she'll be bringing you our first segment, Theatrically Yours, Jane Austen.
Thank you so much, Bianca. They're going to start highlighting everybody now, so if things start moving around in your screen, don't worry. We were discussing ideas for this event. We've had a blank slate, and when we started playing around with the theme of Jane Austen and the arts, which is the upcoming theme for our 2021 JASNA World, right? And it's the 2021 JASNA AGM theme. So we all kind of realized that we're all theater fans in some way, shape, or form. And so we decided that a discussion of Austen around theater would be interesting to explore. So I'm happy to now introduce our panel that we're going to hear from today. Brooke Aiello is a professional actor, costume designer, and professor of theater at California State University, Fresno, and Fresno Pacific University, where she specializes in period acting styles and has directed Michael Bloom's adaptation of Emma. Her professional costuming credits include theater, film, and television, both period and modern, from the Tudor era through the 1940s. Brooke holds an MFA in acting from Southern Mississippi University and has recently performed leading roles in such plays as Venus and Fur, Hedda Gabler, The Merchant of Venice, and Hamlet. Nandita Shenoy is a New York-based actor, writer-actor. Her first full-length play, Lime Park, an Austenian romance of an Indian nature, based on Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, was produced by the Hijira in Washington, D.C. Her Rage play was recently named to the Kilroy's List 2020, and her play Washer Dryer has been produced multiple times nationally after its world premiere at LA's East West Players, and an off-Broadway production in which she also starred. She is a proud member of the Ma Yi Writers Lab and the Dramatists Guild. Nandita holds a BA in English Literature from Yale University, and her website can be found at nanditashenoy.com. Amy Stallings is a professor of history at the College of William and Mary. Amy is also an actor and historical interpreter with Colonial Williamsburg. Her musical adaptation of Northanger Abbey was produced by the Williamsburg Players in 2019. And Hana S. Sharif is a multifaceted theater director, and her career includes roles as an artistic leader, director, playwright, and producer. Hana is also the Augustin family artistic director of the Repertory Theater of St. Louis. She has spent the last 2 decades innovating producerial processes, strengthening community engagement, and producing multiple world and regional premieres. During her tenure as Associate Artistic Director at Baltimore Center Stage, she guided the theater through a multi-million-dollar building renovation and rebranding effort. As a fierce champion of new American plays and playwrights, she has helped develop over 100 plays, including Pulitzer, Tony, and Obie Award-winning masterworks. Hana is the recipient of the 2009-10 Aetna New Voices Fellowship, the EMC Arts Working Open Fellowship, and the TCG New Generations Fellowship. She serves on the board of directors for the Theater Communications Group and the Sprott Foundation. Hana directed Kate Hamill's Sense and Sensibility for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, in addition to other acclaimed productions of Pride and Prejudice for the Repertory Theater of St. Louis and elsewhere, it's what I understand. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And my first question, let's just get started, shall we? Since so many modern audiences often think of Austen as being quaint and obsessed with manners, tea, and bonnets, and your productions, I've noted, have been written up with different words like whimsical and energetic and buoyant. So how do you go about staging an Austen story for a modern audience? Hana, let's go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I find so interesting when I hear words like quaint is that there is actually something incredibly relevant about Austen's work, which is why it survives, you know, the decades and the centuries. The fact that it's been adapted in so many languages in so many ways. I mean, I'm a little bit of a purist, but I have to admit that I did watch Pride and Prejudice Zombies because I just had to see what that was going to look like. And that even in that type of adaptation, the heart, the energy, the soul of these characters is really resonant. And so for me, anytime I'm directing a play, be it a classic or a contemporary new play, my first thought is, what is the most urgent and relevant part of this story for me and for our audiences? And what is so beautiful about Austen's work is that her characters are so rich, so full, and so endearing that you find yourself diving headfirst into their journeys, into their hopes, into their dreams. And you know, and so I actually find it really easy to tell a wonderful, buoyant, whimsical tale when I get to play in Jane Austen's world, because that's what she's crafted for us. And it just survives the ages. That's my experience of it.
And Nandita, yours is a modern update. It's a modern twist on the story, correct? So how did you take all of those elements and put them into a new world?
Well, I mean, I'll say that when, like Hannah, when I see people call Jane Austen quaint, I actually feel like those are people who are not really familiar with Jane Austen, because if you read the books, they're also so dialogue driven that they lend themselves very easily to theater or television or film, because people are just talking all the time. I know that before I really started reading her, I was under this impression, and I actually think it's just sexist, this idea that, you know, female writers just write a lot of flowery description and, you know, things about the wallpaper, where there's very little description, and it is so dialogue driven, all of her work, that I feel it's just so theatrical. So I wrote I would say it's not so much an adaptation, or is it more of a freely inspired by Northanger Abbey, to take that storyline and move it into the present. And so whereas Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey was obsessed with Gothic novels, my protagonist, Kavitha, is obsessed with Jane Austen, and kind of gets into trouble because she tries to turn everything into a Jane Austen novel. And I thought there are so many parallels in the books to what we as women or as people go through in the present. So it really wasn't hard. I think that the stories are very relatable, and they're about people trying to connect with other people and trying to take charge of their own narratives, which I think particularly for women is a very compelling story. So that's what I did with my play.
And Brooke and Amy, now Brooke, your production was of Emma, and Amy, your production was of Northanger Abbey, but they were pretty, what would be considered straight. They were very period adaptations. So how did you approach taking a period adaptation and making it interesting or relevant to a contemporary audience?
Does it matter which of us goes first?
Whoever wants to jump in. Go ahead, Amy.
I am in a peculiar situation in this area in Williamsburg, Virginia, because I have a built-in audience for a period piece, which is an advantage. Nonetheless, I think keeping an adaptation moving briskly from scene to scene, and again, as Nandita said, because it's so dialogue driven, you can keep a pace that I think of its own accord to a certain degree will hold the audience's attention. And for an adaptation of Northanger Abbey, hitting the humor, all the high points of the humor, and really making sure that those moments were translating well to a modern audience was key for me. It was a major part of what I wanted them to take out of it. Here, come see Jane Austen, she's funny. So that was one of the driving forces of the way I chose to adapt Northanger, and I think any of her works lend themselves to that, but perhaps Northanger in particular being so satirical.
And Brooke, what about your production of Emma? What did you find was more effective or less effective with your audiences who are not from Williamsburg? They're in Fresno.
No, they're in Fresno. You haven't heard of it? Don't worry. It ain't a lot. I love it, but I can afford to live here. I think that, first of all, I want to say something about this quaint idea. I think when people say quaint, they're not saying quaint, they're saying female. And that's how it starts to be. It's like a coded way to talk down about a writer. I think that. And so what I did is I just embraced the feminine story, especially in Emma, because it's we decided that Emma was like, everyone's trying to find where they belong, and you want to find your home. And Emma is a story about everybody finding where they fit and finding their home, and realizing that there was a garden analogy too. So I think as when we brought it to something that is especially young people can really identify with, and I think everyone's looking for a home and everyone's looking for where they feel seen and heard, and then it becomes really easy. The thing with Emma, just the structure of the story, it has this like really long denouement, like Knightley and Emma hook up. Spoilers, JK. Knightley and Emma hook up, and you know, there's like 9 hours, it feels like, while we all figure out where she's gonna live. And that was the hardest part about, I think, telling the story. In terms of incorporating like the periodicity of it, for me, that's all just fun. That's all extra tools to use to tell your story, to develop your character, to create your world. And ours wasn't straight period because like ours was like, you know, these like characters that were like in a walking off the pages of the book. So we had like script elements to keep it a little, you know, artsy. We're a liberal arts college. We had to keep it artsy.
Well, that does lead me to another question on my list is, what ideas do you all have about being historically accurate? I mean, accurate when engaging Austen theatrically? Like, how important is it that you be closer to period, or when do you play fast and loose with these types of things? When do you get artsy with it? How do you incorporate period elements into this?
I think, you know, it really is about the nature of the adaptation. And I have, you know, directed Kate Hamill's work, who is less of a purist, really leans into like energy, drive, and humor of the character. She's about the essential story and the essential nature of it, and other things can be cut away. And I know that when I've directed her pieces, sometimes purists are like, but that subplot is missing. But fundamentally, I think it'd be really interesting, Nandita, to hear your point of view on it. But I think that a writer, and because I work so often with playwrights on the journey of building new work, the writer has to determine what is their lens into the story and where are they connecting, and then that becomes the drive through which they tell that version of whatever the play is. And it's one of the reasons why I never get tired of seeing different adaptations of the same play. I could see Sense and Sensibility 15 times because every new adaptation is going to have a slightly different angle on their journey in and through the story. That I find delightful. I know that if that there are some of my friends who are like, strict purist and get very frustrated when important elements to you from the novel aren't in the adaptation. But I think all is forgiven if the characters are right, if the story captures the heart, the energy, the drive, and the passion of the people. The one other thing I was just going to say is that one of my favorite reviews actually was from in Baltimore from a blog for men, like a really kind of chauvinistic-y blog. And the guy said that he bought tickets to the adaptation of Pride and Prejudice because he was hoping it was scoring points with his girlfriend. And then he totally got swept away and thought that all the guys were going to be like stiff and that he wouldn't be able to relate to them. And instead he could relate to everyone, and that he kind of forgot that he was on this chick date because
he was just in a story.
He was just in a story. And also he didn't know that he would see himself on stage. And I think that great adaptations do that. No matter where you find yourself in the kind of like ecosystem, there's some part of you that connects to one or more of Austen's characters on stage, which is part of the appeal. I think that's what keeps bringing me back story after story. But I'm really interested in how the playwrights address and think about that same question.
I'll just speak to it and to like the elephant in the room, which is that as a woman of color, to adapt Austen, like I'm just not going to be historically accurate. And I also, Bianca and I have been on a panel together talking about this conversation about purism, which can also be code for white. And I've been a longtime lover of Jane Austen. I find her stories very compelling, very relatable. Just they speak to me as a person. And I wrote my play partially because I was never afforded the opportunity to audition for any kind of classical work, and certainly not for Jane Austen adaptations. I will say that the last show I did before the pandemic as an actor was Kate Hamill's Sense and Sensibility at Virginia Stage, just down the street from Amy. So that was super fun, and really like, little did I know that maybe that's the bookend of my career, because who knows? But that was also a very multicultural cast, and I was really happy that, I mean, certainly no one said anything to me about, you know, not being white, you know, that, so I'll say with historical accuracy, you know, I adapted freely because I think the story does tell something that's very universal, that it's about, you know, a woman who wants the story to go the way she wants, and who hasn't felt that way, and who's trying to create a story for herself that is like what she reads in books. So I think that that's a lot of the just appeal of Jane Austen at this point. Is, I mean, how many of us have just argued about who's the best Darcy, and why do we love Darcy, and who's Wickham, and you know, all of these kinds of things. Like, they're just very universal themes that I think a lot of people can relate to. So I tried to take a story that I related to and bring it into a context in which I could have characters of all different ethnicities and have them fit in. But, you know, I wrote my play 10 years ago. So it was kind of like crazy to have all these people of different color in a Jane Austen adaptation versus now I do feel like it's pretty run of the mill. So that's my ode to historical accuracy. And the other thing about people who say like, well, that one plot wasn't in whatever, like it's the same thing that happens like from a book to a movie. Like, if you only have 2 to 3 hours, you're just not going to get all the details that's in a novel into an adaptation or into a dramatic version of the book. And so sometimes you have to cut your darlings. You know, and it's sad and it's hard, and there's always some part of the book that I wish I could have shoved in somehow. But you know, at some point, people can't just sit in the theater for like 6 hours. So you know, we have to do what we can.
There's a lot of overlapping things in my next two questions on this. So I'm going to stick right now with the historical accuracy, and we're going to go into the opportunities for diversity in just a second. But Brooke and Amy, both of you have historical interpretation experience and background as well. And I remember when I was doing a lot of that, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not you can actually be historically accurate, so to speak, as a modern person doing this interpretation, and whether or not there's even a place for that in theater, I think is something that is an interesting discussion. So for you two, does any of that inform how you do theater, or do you separate the two things? How do you approach it differently or the same?
I would say personally that I am an actor for exactly the same reason that I'm a historian and a historic interpreter. And it has to do with wanting to dive inside the heads and experience of other people, find out what makes them tick, and then present that to somebody else, or at least, you know, to the extent that I am able to understand it. I think regarding is historical accuracy possible, the short answer is no, and the long answer is yes. Because as one of my colleagues at William and Mary likes to say, and I in turn have learned to impress upon my students, there's a difference between being factual and being true. So the emphasis of historical interpretation, but also of any adaptation of Austen, should be on truthfulness. I mean, having the factual stuff there, you know, that can be icing on the cake if you want to go the route that we did, because we had the ability to be very precise about your costumes and that sort of thing. But it doesn't need to be constrained by historical fact to effectively convey a historical truth or a narrative truth. So as Hana, I think, was saying earlier, the spirit and the essence of Austen's characters and the spirit and essence of the world that she creates is the more important element, the truthful element, rather than the factual element. And that's what can be translated so well among all kinds of different audiences and time periods.
Yeah, I'm in a similar world to that. I would say that for me, when I'm thinking about historical interpretation, it's much more about guiding the audience to a deeper understanding of something that's physically before them, whether that's, you know, a gown or a butter churn, et cetera, et cetera. And when I think of what I do as an actor or as a director, is it just becomes all about story, and it becomes so much more about less like guiding my audience and more just like, what's less violent than shove? What's a caring way to say shove? Like it's what?
Gently shove.
Gently shove, yes, a friendly shove. It's less kid gloves. It's more about like, this is the story, and there's a certain level of uncomfortableness that I strive for in those things, just in the truthiness of it. Truthiness. Okay, but like just in the very truth of it, I feel like I want it to be uncomfortable, and I always find myself maybe inaccurately shying away from some of the uncomfortableness of truth when I am doing like a first person or a direct historical interpretation or historical theatrical character. Does that make sense? Anyways, that's what I think.
I think I'm getting the overall impression there. But there is a difference in how you approach something theatrical that is intended to be told from an angle with a point of view on a story that is intended to honor the spirit of the story, but is not necessarily all about being the factual version of the story. Is that fair? Fairish. We'll keep going with that. But all of that being said, you know, we are now in an age where there's a lot of discussion about opportunities for diversity. And so I wanted to ask you all with your thoughts about opportunities, not just for diverse casting, although that's a big one in Austen adaptations, but also the opportunities and the importance of having diversity, what I call behind the table, behind the director's table, behind the producer's table, and how that works in terms of theater, particularly with regard to Austen adaptations, but any sort of period adaptation would be fine. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, as far as Austen's work, I share this often, like Austen was revelatory for me as a young person. I remember finding my grandmother's copy of Sense and Sensibility. It was like an old red leather bound copy, and I found it when I was 11 years old and started reading it and fell in love with Austen's work. And I fell in love with the work because I fell in love with the heroines of her stories that always felt like slightly out of step with the world that they were in. And I related to that in a fundamental way as a young Black girl growing up in Houston, Texas. And so for me, there was never a question about whether or not I, as an artist, would be able to tell the story. It's a story that I found myself in when I was 11 years old, and I fell in love with her work and continued to kind of build my relationship with Jane Austen's world. The only time there was a question is actually when you get to the kind of structural biases of our business, which says, well, can you direct a classic? The first time that I directed a Jane Austen piece, I quite intentionally had a very diverse creative team. And I also quite intentionally did an all-white cast. And it's the only time I've done an Austen piece with an all-white cast. But I made those choices with great consciousness because I wanted to debunk the myth, one, that directors and artists of color who are creatives are only able to tell a story through their ethnically specific lens, which is a way that which is a myth that has actually held many artists of color back from being able to tackle great classics, right? So if you're only being hired to direct the one night play at a theater each year, then that limits your opportunity rather than being seen as someone who is skilled in craft and understands and can direct shows of great scale that are not ethnically specific. Well, and you know, there's of course the notion that all plays are ethnically specific plays, including mainstream white plays. So I kind of built a team full of people of color who were passionate about the story. That the play was an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, a world premiere adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. And it was a lot of fun, and it was a great journey. I will say, I remember after a talk back, there was a gentleman who kept saying, I just don't understand why you did the story. Like, I don't understand why you directed it. And I don't understand why you directed it like this. Like, I figured if you were going to do it, like you were going to put a twist on it and like it would be like an interracial cast. And you know, it was really wonderful to have that conversation with him and to break it down to say, I actually would love to do a interracially, you know, diverse Austen piece and planned to, but this production's vision was to do this. And I said, my question to you is, why are you struggling with the idea that it is possible that I produced that show, that I produced and I directed that show that you loved? Why is that so hard for you to accept? Just kind of turning the questions back to him on what's really behind it, because you just saw that show and you loved it and you're struggling. Let's get behind your struggle. So I share that to say, the reality is there's no barrier because the characters have been so richly written and they translate across culture, across race, across, you know, and anytime you have a story that really reflects the core of our humanity, then anyone who has craft will be able to approach that story and elevate the core of it. And I think that especially for artists of color who are passionate about classic works, and those who certainly, like me, have found a piece of myself in Austen's world, I think it's really important that we continue to kind of break down those barriers and really challenge the mythology around the limitations to the work, because I actually think that the work is universal and translatable and relatable. And I feel that's like just part of the responsibility.
Any other experiences with that? I resonate with that, because about 10 years ago, I was having similar conversations, you know, with similar types of people around women in cross-gendered castings in Shakespeare. And I'm hearing similar conversations continue to happen around people of color. And so I have to think that this is happening everywhere. This should not be, this is not a surprise to me. But do any of you others have any experiences, positive or negative, with your experiences in casting diverse people or being behind the table?
I mean, I just cast the best people, and it happened that there were a couple people of color in my cast. But you know, I just want to say, Hannah, I'm so moved by what you said, because I have struggled so much this year with the idea that a lot of what I feel like I offer theater, as somebody who is into period styles, as somebody who loves classics, maybe is just irrelevant now, because I've suddenly felt like all those stories I love, where's like maybe it's just time for me to sit out for a while, which still may be true, but I had never thought of it in terms of it being a limiting thing. I always thought to because of the structures, you know, not have more BIPOC artists, you know, in playing with those Greek and Shakespeare and other classical ideas, because I really was like, well, why do we need to tell this middle-class white guy story again, or this upper-class white woman story again? But if you look at it through that other lens, then it really is so much about just giving people to tell their story through the lens of that. And you blew my mind a little bit. I'm in love with it. Thank you for bringing that to this table discussion. That's all.
I also just want to say, it went by in the chat, and I'm not sure who did it, who said it, but also to say that purism shouldn't be, or that historical accuracy does not mean a lack of diversity. You know, in Jane Austen's time, in fact, England was at the height of empire, and I certainly have a hard time imagining that there wasn't a single person of Indian descent living in England at the time. So, you know, on the other hand, like, I think it's perfectly fine to cast me in a historically accurate version of any of those plays. But that's not what we have all been educated to understand as pure. And so, I mean, that's where I think, you know, the work needs to be done. So I don't think that you're irrelevant, Brooke. I think that there are just lots of ways to tell the story, and that we should be looking for lots of different ways to keep telling these stories, because there obviously is something so compelling that we have 170 people wanting to talk about Jane Austen and theater on a Saturday afternoon during the Christmas holiday season. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I love that as well. I like I said, ever since for 10 years now, I've been thinking about pushing back on these ideas of what is a pure or traditional or any of these notions, and really just trying to open up myself and my point of view, along with the work of the people I work with, to question that as often as possible. And that goes for, you know, like I said, women, body diversity, you know, able-bodied, this type of, all kinds of diverse aspects of this should be questioned and put forth as often as we possibly can. And starting with just casting with the people who do the best work, who have the best craft, is a way to start, I think. So given all of that, what advice do you have for people who are tackling a classical piece, a period piece, whether it be in film or on stage, in their approach? What first pieces of advice might you give? Just do it. just find the money, put it up.
I mean, yeah, find the money and put it up. I would say try to find your neighbors in the piece. Like if I'm struggling for a way in when I'm reading a script, I try to find my neighbors. I try to find that guy at the coffee shop in it and try to work through that way. But you know, take that as it is. Oh, and if you love research, just get into it. Like if you just like get into the research, I bet you'll find like a little beautiful nugget of something that will be like, I swear to God, I could have written this diary entry, and then that'll open all your doors. Man, research is so cool. Do your research. That's my real thing.
As a director, I always start with my productions always start with a metaphor that is physically manifested. So I read the story, there's something really urgent either about the way the story is being told, and I think of what the metaphor is, and then I begin to dream that metaphor forward. When I was working with Christopher Baker, who did the adaptation of Pride and Prejudice that I worked on, he was like really into Gilmore Girls at the time. He and his daughter were like obsessively watching Gilmore Girls, and he called me and he's like, I have been stuck. And then I realized that like the Gilmore Girls is it's just Pride and Prejudice. Like it's just Jane Austen's super smart, witty, funny, beautiful women slightly. And I was like, yes. And he's like, I'm going to go back and I'm going to let the Gilmore Girls drive me through. And so just kind of embracing, finding whatever that thing is that makes it urgent, relevant, and timely for you. And then again, for me as an interpretive artist, as a director, it's about what is the metaphor? And then that becomes a through line for me to also guide actors through the story and how we're going to actually connect the material, the physical world, and the energy of the production.
It's actually one of my favorite things as an audience member when I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, watching the whole thing, and I find, oh, I'm finding this little nugget of something right there, and then I'll talk to the director afterwards. They'll be like, yeah, that was like what I built the whole thing around. What about in terms of putting together costumes and props and these types of things? What kind of advice or thoughts do you have? Do you have a particular approach to that? Brooke is the costumer, although Amy is wearing a beautiful costume, and so. I guess this goes back a little bit to the period styles aspect of it. Do you try and do things very strictly? Or because, you're always going to have the two people in the back row who are like, they did not use buttons that way. So what's your mindset around that? Let me put it that way.
I think that the most important thing is the why behind things. So, I want to know when I'm talking about like period deportment or like period styles or like even just like period movement is what's the why? Like what were their undergarments like? Like what were their boobs doing? How were they sitting? How did they ride? How did they not ride? How much did they walk? What were they? All of those whys. And then I find as long as you are giving them similar whys, the period works, and generally 9 times out of 10, the audience is going to buy it. So when we did Emma, we did a whole bunch of like vests that we made into like little short sleeveless Spencers, and it gave the why that we were looking for, right? We just like chopped off the shoulders and pulled them up, and bing bang, Bob's your uncle. We had a whole bunch of sleeveless Spencers. And I think that as long as you are communicating the why and supporting the story, then the rest of it tends to fall into place. I personally, I find that if a designer or a production gets too hung up on all of that stuff. I mean, it's like nobody wants to see Chekhov where everybody knows exactly how to take tea from the samovar and nobody knows why Irina is crying, right? Nobody wants to see that production. And I just feel like Jane Austen is the same way. Like people want to understand to the why. And if you give them the why, then I think it all falls into place. But you know, I could be saying that because the theater I do, you physically can't do historically accurate. Like it's not film. Like we simply cannot. So this could all just be like justification for not doing it. Although really, if you're counting buttons, my production has already failed, right? I mean, there's so many bigger problems in this production if you're counting the buttons. So I need to go back to school and find a new career at that point, you know? Anyways.
Are there any other thoughts on that? I think I want to go to the chat. We might have some questions in the chat at this point, and then I might come back and ask you all for a little wrap-up question. But Bianca, do we have any questions coming up in the chat?
Yeah, we have some questions. I have a quick one that we can probably get done fast. Nandita, where and how can people read Lime Park?
Sadly, it is not published. So if you would like to read Lime Park, you can email me through my website and I will send it to you. But I will tell publishers that somebody wants to read it.
I would love to read it.
I will send it to you.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think many someones want to read it. We have another question. I know people who can't relate to the limitations on life options for Austen's women, marriage, teaching, or living off male relatives. For the modern adapters, was it difficult to find contemporary limitations for your characters?
No. I could elaborate. I will say one thing that I think really spoke to me when I really dug into Austen when I was in my early 20s. And I think that part of what drew me to it was, as a child of Indian immigrants, that pressure to get married was so intense by my, larger family and by the Indian culture in this country of like, you need to get married and you need to get married to a certain kind of person. And so that I really, really related to in Jane Austen novels in a way that I actually feel like my white friends whose family had been in America for, generations and generations didn't. So that's something that was very real and very potent to me. But that said, I also think that pressure for women to get married, to be legitimate in some way, is very real across gender. I mean, not across gender, definitely for women. But it's a societal pressure that I feel happens for, especially as women maybe approach, I don't know, for me, I'd say 35, when like it got really like, what are you doing and why aren't you married? By people my age, people older than me, people younger than me. And so I think that that's modern and real. And, maybe the ages are different. I don't think that people are pressuring women at 19 to get married, but certainly if you just move the ages up a little bit, I think it's very similar. And I think that's why it's so popular still.
Yeah, I definitely feel like women in general, we still have pressures for a certain timeline. The timelines may have changed, so yeah, you make any Austen heroine 35 or 40, and different expectations start barreling down at them, and then later on as well. So it's a different sort of expectation when you're pushing 50. Any other questions, Bianca?
We have another one that I think could be interesting. What Jane Austen character do you relate to most?
Miss Bates.
Real
wish I
talk
could-
from Brooke.
That was some real talk, yeah. It's, I wish I could say someone else, but alas.
I just want to say, Brooke, I mean, now I've known Brooke for 15 years, so if there was a real life Miss Bates, like if Miss Bates could, I don't know. I understand where that's coming from, but at the same time, I'm also like, she would be the most entertaining character if it were you. Anybody else? Anyone that you just always go back to when you
I'm
reread?
always Lizzie. I'm just going to say the obvious is that, you know, in my heart, I'm Elizabeth Bennet everywhere I go.
I feel the same way. And have most of my life at this point. Yeah.
I was never confident enough to make any such claim. I grew up identifying strongly with Catherine Morland and with Fanny Price. I would probably, at this point in life, err still more on the side of Catherine Morland because I'm extraordinarily gullible, even as very much an adult at this point. So there's a reason I adapted Northanger and not one of the other books. There are multiple reasons, but that's one of them.
Speaking of Northanger, though, we have a question for you, Amy, about what it was like adapting that into a musical.
What it was like. The musical version came to be only at a fairly late stage. It was a project that I'd been working on for some time. When I was an undergraduate at William and Mary, actually, I presented it as a play version, and it was awful. I will say that very openly. And then when I was in graduate school, I had what I thought was a crazy idea when I was rereading Northanger. And at that time, I had just seen a musical production of Pride and Prejudice, and I was keeping up to date with some of the other musical versions that were in the works at the time. And I thought, what a shame you can't make a musical version of Northanger Abbey because Catherine says point blank that she never sings. Wait a minute. So it was a challenge to myself. Can I write a musical adaptation of Northanger Abbey wherein Catherine does not sing and is still the lead character? And I just kept going. I wrote a few songs. I'd actually written a few songs based on Northanger Abbey at a much younger age that I then set lyrics to, because my grand vision at the beginning was that it was going to be a feature film, you know, as though I ever had the budget and the connections to produce such a thing. So some of the songs that were my soundtrack for my movie became songs with lyrics in the musical version when I made that transition. And it honestly made a much tighter work. I chopped a lot of the dialogue out. I put it into music. It made the pace brisker, even though you generally think of, I don't know, the songs as sort of slowing things down to a certain degree. I found the opposite was true when I was translating it from a play form to a musical. It became much livelier and funnier as a musical, I feel. There are still things that I would change if I went back and did it again, but the overall experience, you know, looking at a scene and deciding, is there enough here to do this as a song instead of just as dialogue? Or, you know, what it led me to delve into certain scenes of the book that I hadn't really taken the time to examine at length, like the visit to Woodston. And that takes up a page, you know, of my copy of Northanger Abbey. And instead of going through that as dialogue, I said, this would be a lot more fun if they were singing about how messy Henry's room is. So pulling out the little nuances and using the music to create relationships between characters that sort of fly under the radar to a certain degree. if you were taking only the dialogue that's in the book. Like, I was able to beef up the relationship between Captain Tilney and Isabella Thorpe in song form. And I think, yeah, there were moments that definitely lent themselves to that interpretation. So I hope that answers the question.
And as a final question that kind of segues into, I'm sure, our wrap up, what are the best places to follow all of your work? We got a lot of questions about this, so please promote where to follow you because people want to know.
So what's your website? Do you guys have, do y'all have any websites, social media? Where can these folks plug into your work? Nandita's Johnny on the spot with her stuff. My last question is, what do you all think is the most theatrical thing or element of Jane Austen? That's the first part. Just generally, however you interpret that. And the second one is, what's coming up for you? What projects do you have percolating? And that'll be our capstone. Theatrical elements, go.
I'll go back to just saying it's the dialogue, because plays are about people talking much more so than movies, where you have a lot more scenic information in the script. So I just think that when you read her novels, it's just back and forth, and that feels very theatrical to me. I am working on a couple of new plays that will hopefully get homes after we can return to gathering. So check out my website.
I think the heightened nature of the relationships, right? The kind of, at times, operatic scale of the journey that relationships take are highly theatrical. That's the kind of thing that is really the engine of a play. And I think that Austen's novels really give you, they're chock full of it, right? There are quiet moments that still have this kind of epic emotional scale. And there's heat that's simmering right underneath, which of course makes for great theater, it pulls you to the edge of your seat. So those elements that I think are classic, whether you're in one of the most popular works or the lesser adapted works for the stage, I think there's incredible opportunity. I'm really eager to see more adaptations of, like, Persuasion is one I think actually has been underperformed, and would love to kind of dive into that. So, and then in terms of what I'm working on, I'm artistic director for theater. So right now I'm working like the Dickens to get my theater reopened post-pandemic. Working to get some national funding, relief funding for the arts. So working with lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to see if we can get some support for artists and arts organizations. And then outside of that, I'm working as a playwright. I have my own trilogy that is looking at 100 years of family mythology that I'm working on, 3-play cycle. And then there are a number of plays in new works with playwrights who I'm in love with their work that we're just working on developing and trying to launch it into the world. So I am fascinated with how people, artists in particular, are continuing to feed their souls and also share their work even virtually. This kind of forum at a time where we can't go into theaters together, that really inspires me. And I'm always looking to see what other folks are working on, and I'll be checking out your websites too to get to know your work better. It's been a real pleasure to be on this panel with everyone.
Amy, what about you?
As far as what makes Austen theatrical, I would have to second what Nandita said about the dialogue. I was having a discussion with a friend of mine the other day on precisely that subject. And in a sense, I think the dialogue heaviness of her work lends itself better to stage than it does to film, because she doesn't have those sweeping, establishing shots that she's writing for us all. But it's also really wonderful stuff for an actor to work with. I think that's a different sort of theatricality, but as an actor, that's a character, any Jane Austen character really, is one that I would say, I want to play that. And I've played in the past Caroline Bingley, and it led me back to the book again to say, you know, what of Caroline Bingley's personality can I tease out of the text here and bring to my interpretation of the character for the stage in a way that perhaps the audience won't have thought about Caroline Bingley before. And frankly, I came out of that experience with a much higher opinion of Caroline Bingley, which I hold to this day. But I think the same can be said for any Austen character, and I love that about her characters. As for, I don't have any imminent future projects. I have a distant dream. Want to get really obscure and niche, right? I would like to write a musical version of Anthony Trollope's The Warden, which no one would come see. But
I love Trollope.
Okay, excellent. But I have this vision of the invisible cello playing, you know, and the music just emerging out of nowhere. But anyway, that's in the very distant future, probably. In the meantime, during the pandemic, I wrote a novel which will probably never see the light of day. But there you go.
I want to read your novel. Send it. I'll read it. That sounds really fun. What makes Austen theatrical? I think it's that hot British repression.
British repression.
I just think no one's allowed to say what they want. No one's allowed to grab and kiss. No one's allowed, you know, make the beast with two backs. And it's all like everything you want to do is off limits. So I think that makes for good scenes, which makes for good plays. And then what am I working on? Well, I mean, I'm trying to get grades in on time. So that's the first thing I'm working on. And then the second thing I am working on is a devised piece, but now I may be writing it, of when the 1918 flu pandemic hit Fresno, they canceled all their shows, you know, like you're supposed to. But the first thing they did when they came back was like a fashion show of medieval clothes. And so I want to do like a Stoppard-esque, yeah, I want to do like a Stoppard-esque, a modern chick, and then a 1918 chick, and then like a medieval chick, and it kind of culminates in the final scene with the costumes. I want it to be about women and the uneven burden they carry during times of pandemic. And then also maybe about a little bit about, because it's Fresno, some of the like colonialism and stuff in that pandemic, those kind of things. You know, I've written about a page, but who knows? That's in my brain. That's what I want to do. So we'll see what happens.
Well, I want to thank you all for spending this time with us, and for everybody who participated in the chat. At this point, we are, let's see, we're going to take a couple of minutes. We're going to let you refresh your tea and stretch your legs. And if you want, you can say hi in the chat. I hope our panelists will drop in their emails, etc., or their social media in the chat so that folks can follow them and find them. Once again, I'd like to thank Hana S. Sharif, Amy Stallings, Nandita Shenoy, and Brooke Aiello for spending this time with us today. We fervently hope that our theaters can open again in 2021, and we'll get to experience more of your work very, very soon. So with that said, take a few minutes and then we're going to come back for some social time with the Janites. See you in a few.